Hi, this is Dr. Mike Chupp, and you are listening to CMDA Matters, the weekly podcast of the Christian Medical and Dental Associations. I'm back this week with another video podcast, but before I jump into today's interview, I have a special update for you. Over the last month, I've been sharing with you some exciting news about a $320,000 matching gift. Well, we've received almost half of that matching gift from you, our donors, but we still have a ways to go. I also know that your generosity can play a key role in getting us to that entire match by June 30th, the end of our fiscal year. I am praying that God has placed this opportunity on your heart because, as he said in 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 6 through 8, through the Apostle Paul, remember this: whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever sows generously will also reap generously. Each of you should give what you have decided in your heart to give, Paul said, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for our God, he loves a cheerful giver. Well, you can give online at cmda.org/match or just by calling a member of our stewardship team at 888-230-2637 today. I want to thank you for being a faithful servant of God and for prayerfully considering how you can make a kingdom difference today. Well, speaking of making a difference, our guest today is clearly making a difference for Christ in today's culture. He's a familiar voice to so many of you, our listeners, through his work with the Colson Center. So let's jump right into our discussion with Mr. John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center. I want to welcome you today to a very special edition of CMDA Matters, another video podcast. And my co-host today is Reverend Bert Jones, who is our Director of Leadership and Church Relations. And so welcome to the podcast, Bert.
Thank you, Dr. Chupp. It's good to be here today.
So our guest today is none other than the president of the Colson Center, John Stonestreet, a sought-after author and speaker. He has spoken at our national convention. When I hear the word worldview, like it could be in a dictionary, and I would see the picture of John Stonestreet because he talks about worldview quite a bit. Education, apologetics, theology. He's the voice of the Breakpoint podcast, and he's the voice of The Point, a daily one-minute feature on worldview, apologetics, and culture issues. Before he went to the Colson Center in 2010, John served in several leadership capacities with Summit Ministries and was on the Biblical Studies faculty at Bryan College in Tennessee. He's co-authored 5 books. He's married to Sarah, and they have 4 children and live in Colorado Springs. Welcome to the program, John Stonestreet.
Oh, hey, listen, it's great. I love CMDA. You guys, especially right now, I'm never going to get into a lot of this, but the role you guys play for Christians in culture is so critical. So it's an honor. Thanks so much.
Let's jump right into the topic that you agreed to talk about today. A really hot topic right now. Health and Human Services is talking about rescinding a conscience protection rule that we all celebrated at CMDA from 2018, now rescinding it. So wanted to talk a little bit about protecting conscience in healthcare and why it even matters. And how would you encourage our members who are resistant, doctors not always interested in getting out in the public square, how would you challenge them to get involved right now?
Well, look, it would be one thing if advocacy today meant that we were trying to get everyone to behave like Christians. That's not what we're facing. What we're facing, and you mentioned the HHS mandate, I would also, a new HHS mandate. Whenever I hear the HHS mandate, I start, with the tics because of the previous one from the Obama administration under Kathleen Sebelius, which was mandating organizations to provide abortifacients. Now this one is 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 steps beyond that with a lot of the same issues. In other words, we're not dealing with a advocacy, which means we're trying to get non-Christians to act like Christians. what we're dealing with is a government that's trying to get Christians to act like non-Christians. In other words, these core beliefs that we have about morality and anthropology, what's right and wrong, and who are we as human beings, the government is attempting in various ways to get people in the public square to comply. They're doing it in the sphere of business. It's certainly happening in the sphere of big tech, whether you can be an elected official and what that means. And now also with this mandate, it's going to affect insurance companies and healthcare providers in various ways. So I think that's what we have to understand. It's kind of like, if you go back to the 80s, there was this theory that really there was this group of Christian conservatives like Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell who were trying to force a theocracy on America. And if you go back and actually look at what happened, you had the 60s and 70s, the outlawing of prayer in schools, abortion on demand. In other words, it had less to do with Christians trying to impose their will on the culture and more to do with the state and state forces trying to, get Christians to compromise convictions that aren't up in the air. That's really what this is about, if you ask me.
John, it's kind of a two-pronged question here, but in a society that seems to be captivated by a cancel culture, how do you see America's foundational documents and the faith of our founding fathers still having an impact in this moment of time? And would you say that we're witnessing the attempt to conceal and to cancel those important documents?
That is a great question. There's certainly been a long time attempt and kind of a historical revisionism to look back and remove the significance of that way of thinking about life in the world. This conversation about kind of our founders and founding documents has really devolved into whether they were sincere personal Christians or not, and whether they were evangelicals in the same sense that we are, or deeply religious or something like that. And you'd have one side of that would say yes, and here are their quotes, and other sides that would say no, they were, complete secularists and, who believed in the separation of church and state. And the truth is, at neither of those extreme ends, the truth is, though, that America's founding was built on an understanding of the human person, that fundamentally we were responsible, before we were responsible to the state, we were responsible to God. And that there was a recognition of rights that the government did not grant. So therefore, the government cannot take them away. These are rights granted by being created. We know that line from the Declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident, and that we have been endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. And what those rights are: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That is a fundamentally different vision of the human person and human freedom and how society works and the relationship between the state and the citizen than, say, what was happening at pretty much the same time period in France. Os Guinness has done some wonderful work here comparing the French Revolution to the American Revolution. And it doesn't have anything to do really, it does, but it doesn't have a whole lot to do with whether the individual players themselves were personally converted. It was a worldview question. It was how they thought about the role of the state, the role of the government, the place of law, where laws come from, and human dignity and individuality. And then also there was this space that had been created in the American society for what many thinkers have called mediating institutions. That's a really important distinction. So when Alexis de Tocqueville, for example, comes and writes about this kind of adolescent America and the good and the bad and the ugly, one of the things he says is that a distinction of America is that you have the state and you have the citizen, and in between you have a really thick middle. What that means is you had families and churches and voluntary institutions and state and even citywide and countywide governments. In other words, you had a whole lot of protection between the individual and the federal government. And of course, what we have seen, particularly in the last several decades, is the erosion of that middle, so that there's really nothing buffering between the individual citizen claiming their rights and the big state saying, here's how I want you to think and how I want you to behave. That loss is probably the most significant headline when it comes to civics, when it comes to the civic situation in America. It is just absolutely huge because it allows so many other things to take place, and it trivializes this part of the American experience that teaches us what it means to be an American. So that's one of the challenges right now is we don't have a strong civic education. We don't have a strong and robust family. The church has less of a role in American life than it used to. Robert Putnam wrote this years ago. He goes, more people are bowling, but less people are joining bowling leagues. So these voluntary associations aren't there. In other words, it's just a very thin middle in American culture. I think coming out of COVID, we saw some of the results of that. So when you see the deaths of despair, the isolation of individuals, and how individuals reacted to that, that's a big headline of COVID. This wasn't created by COVID, but it was how we went through COVID without strong communities, many people without strong families and identification. Even families that are together are all separated by, glowing cell phones everywhere. There's been a big shift here, and it's worth noting the difference that makes.
John, focusing in on this defense of conscience, and I think there are probably a number of reasons why Christians, the church, and healthcare professionals who follow Christ maybe don't engage in the defense of conscience. What would you say, how would you say we can better equip healthcare professionals and others in the church to defend something so basic but something so critical as conscience rights or the duty of conscience?
Yeah. Well, look, I think the conscience rights are embedded in the Constitution. I think that's really clear, especially the First Amendment and the Bill of Rights. I mean, it starts with this idea that there is an allegiance that we have to our conscience and to the God of our conscience that precedes the right of the state. And unless the state has some compelling interest, let's say, to prevent public harm, let's say if someone believes in their conscience that they should, sacrifice, poodles, it's in the public interest to say, no, you have to limit that conscience. You can't do everything that you want. But if there's not a compelling interest here, then you know what? The government has to create space for that. Now, it's there. And I think that's a good enough reason, because we're citizens of America. We're not citizens of another nation, to look at conscience rights and saying, you know what, it's a better place to be in a country where there are these sorts of rights than in a country like North Korea or China or other places that restrict those conscience rights. Part of that is religious freedom. Now, one of the things that Chuck Colson noticed before he died is that how religious freedom had long been understood was being reinterpreted from religious freedom to what the word that was being used at the time by that particular presidential administration was freedom of worship. And one of the things he pointed out is the freedom of worship is something really that is universally held. Even in many places like even China, you have the right to believe what you want in your own head and maybe in your own home, maybe your own house of worship in your own heart, but you can't take it into the public square. The distinction of religious freedom is that not only do you get to believe it, and you get to believe it with your friends, but you actually get to take those convictions into your public life and order your public life around them. There are limits, again, but that this is something that has been part of the American experience. Now, I think there's a reason to steward this just because it's been good. And, we should protect things that are good, Look, there's nothing in there in the Bible that says thou shalt have indoor plumbing, but indoor plumbing is a good thing. Like, we should protect it.
Amen.
Now, I think there's more to it, by the way, on religious freedom, but hold tight. What I'm trying to say is religious freedom is a good in and of itself. That's enough reason to care about it. Another reason is because the work has been done by the Religious Freedom Institute and others that freedoms are interconnected. So if you want freedom of the press, and you want freedom of assembly, then conscience rights are part of that. If you want economic freedoms, the Religious Freedom Institute and then others have demonstrated that where religious freedom flourishes, these other freedoms tend to flourish as well. Mm-hmm. So in other words, there's a causal relationship here, or at least a correlative relationship. And I think some work has even been done to point to a more causal relationship, that cultures that have religious freedom tend to have economic flourishing. And cultures that have economic flourishing now have a bigger social safety net, can take care of the poor and the downcast and so on. In other words, not only is it a good in and of itself, but it actually leads to other goods. That's another reason we should support religious freedom. As followers of Christ, we should support religious freedom because it has been a part of the church teaching from the very beginning. We know in church history there have been attempts to coerce people into faith. Whenever that's happened, that has been an evil that has been done at the hands of the church. Mm-hmm. If you go back to the earliest Christian document that we have outside of Scripture called the Didache, also there were some church teachings from the church fathers. I believe Irenaeus said this, that there's no compulsion in Christianity. Chuck Colson used to say, we don't impose, we propose, we offer. Mm-hmm. And we believe that an imposed faith is not a real faith. We believe that people are created in God's image. Therefore, their first and foremost relationship is not with us. It's not with the state. It's with God. We believe that that is true of every single person, whether they realize it or not. Well, if we believe that, then we want a situation in which that can flourish. And it's good for our neighbors, including our pagan neighbors. So you put all that together, and Christians should support religious freedom for the same reason they should support any other really good thing that's been good for the world.
At CMDA, we talk about right of conscience. We talk about it all the time. But at the beginning of the pandemic, our wonderful ethics committee generated a statement about the duty to care and the fact that we have a duty as healthcare professionals, whether we're Christians or not, to care for people, even though there's risk to ourselves. Here's my question for you. It seems to me that it would be strategic that we stop talking all about our rights. Yeah, there's some rights, gave the right to become children of God in John chapter 1. But what about a focus more on our duty to contend for conscientious practice of healthcare?
When you talk about responsibilities and rights and privileges, first of all, let's just acknowledge that historically it's an anomaly to have the luxury to talk about such things. In most cultures in the history of the world, most governments did not recognize rights, responsibilities, and privileges, or they recognized one or the other, or they severely limited. So it is absolutely a good thing to be able to talk about those. But they do come in a package deal. David Stevens and I had this conversation probably the last time I was on this podcast, which was a while ago, about artificial reproductive technologies. One of the things that's driving artificial reproductive technologies into areas that are unethical and that lead to the discarding and killing of embryos is treating children as a right that I should be able to claim. And claiming that right instead of claiming the responsibility of citizenship and the privileges of a blessing of children as being from God. Now we have these laws being passed under the term of universal parentage acts, where we have the right to manufacture children and have the children that we want when we want. We have the crisis of international surrogacy, commercial surrogacy, and even in some cities in America as well. All of this comes from a misunderstanding of rights. I think that one of the tactical things we got to do moving forward is when we talk about religious freedom as something that we have, it's something that we all have. I don't want to just defend my religious freedom. I need to be able to articulate the good of religious freedom for everyone, including the freedom of people not to believe. Increasingly, defending free speech is not just defending the speech of people that are controversial, but it's defending people's rights not to be forced to say things that they don't believe, right? Whether you're talking about educators, whether you're talking about, cake artists and florists, that's where a lot of that lands right now. So I think you're onto something. I think that this isn't something, unfortunately, that we talk about, this relationship between rights and responsibilities and privileges. And I guess maybe part of that is, it doesn't even make much sense to talk about that if you don't believe there's a God. Because when you talk about rights and responsibilities and privileges, unless it's either self-imposed on the world or, demanded from the government, those words as universals only make sense if there's a God who created us and who cares and loves us. And unfortunately, it hasn't been part of our catechesis as followers of Christ culturally, and it should be.
John, I like what you said there about the church seems to be losing some ground and losing influence. And then also you're talking about the right of our ability to speak up, the freedoms of speech and things like that. But it seems like the church is being scared into silence. Like we shouldn't be speaking about this, and a lot of people are just staying quiet at this time. Do you have any thoughts about how the church can work together effectively to advocate for those freedoms of conscience and the issues of our faith that we care about, and at the same time, how we can continue to advocate and advance the gospel? Because sometimes it seems like we're left with it. Do we speak up and lose our right to speak about the gospel? Can we speak on these cultural issues and still advance the gospel? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh gosh, yeah, lots of them actually, because it is a little bit of a mess. It's interesting. The weekend that Chuck Colson collapsed, which was in 2012, at Wilberforce Weekend, which is our conference, he was the event was called talking about the spiral of silence, and that was a phrase that a German philosopher and social critic had come up with in the wake of the Second World War, basically asking, like, look, a lot of people thought Hitler was crazy and evil, so how did he rise to power? And how did he keep power? And how did he dominate that cultural moment? And the conclusion was this thing called a spiral of silence, that when people are afraid to talk, more people are afraid to talk, more people are afraid to talk. And you know what makes less people afraid to talk? One person talking. You know, I used to live in Tennessee, and there used to be an old guy in my church who'd be like, it ain't rocket surgery, you know, and this kind of fits into that it ain't rocket surgery category. You know, it's like basically courage is contagious and we embolden each other. The church has not been in a situation where to maintain Christian orthodoxy has been considered hateful. We have, over the last couple of decades, kind of moved through a time where, you know, to maintain Christian orthodoxy is to be considered prudish or outdated or traditional and, you know, frowned upon. It is a different day altogether when to say what Christians, and by the way, almost everyone in civilization said about, you know, for example, what it means to be male and female, what marriage should be, what sexuality should be, what counts as a ethical behavior, not ethical behavior, is now considered to be not just wrong, but evil. That's a different moment.
Right.
I think that unfortunately, one of the things that's happening is many churches have kind of bought into that freedom of worship mentality, which is they won't come in here and tell us what to say, which is good. I hope that no pastor ever allows the state to demand their messaging. Like, by the way, some of our fellow brothers and sisters around the world have to deal with every single week. I mean, you think about China's, you know, in many ways, in many communities, trying to tell pastors what I think the Chinese Communist Party actually produced a new Bible last year. You know, that we listen to that, it sounds like craziness. We're like, well, we won't do that. They want to come in here. They won't force me to perform this marriage. They won't, you know, come in here and tell me what to do. The problem is that the Christian life is not to be lived in the church. The church's purpose, according to Ephesians chapter 5, is to equip the saints for the work of the ministry, implying that the pastors don't do ministry. They do equipping. It's the saints that do ministry. They don't do ministry in the church. They do it wherever they go. This is the Great Commission. The challenge here, I think, is that when we say they won't force me as a pastor or as a missionary or as a teacher, as an educator to violate my conscience. Well, that's great for you, but what about the doctor in your congregation? What about the teacher in your congregation? We had this conversation across the board when it comes to Jack Phillips, the baker in Colorado, a dear friend. I had pastors say, you know, well, they won't come and make me perform a same-sex wedding. Well, good. I hope that you will have courage if that ever happens. But if all of life is lived coram Deo before God, if we all have a calling, and if a calling is to, you know, whether God's called you to be a missionary or to be a physician or to be a missionary physician or whatever, then if a pastor shouldn't be forced to preach a sermon, then a baker shouldn't be forced to bake a cake, because what he is doing is an act of worship before God, just like your sermon. Mm-hmm. This is the reform. I mean, this goes back to the reformers pushing this idea of vocation or calling, that it's not just the priest and the bishops that are called. Everyone is called, because everyone lives life coram Deo before God.
And John, supporting the rest of the body of Christ, I just finished in my local church here in Bristol teaching our bioethics curriculum called Bridging the Gap. And one of our elders in the church, I just said, okay, talk to me, guys. What have you learned in the last 8 or 9 weeks? I hope it's been something. And he said something to me, it was like an aha moment for me. I guess I felt like the church should always have its doors open, and we should be open to LGBTQ. We should demonstrate the love of Christ. I never thought about the fact that you, Dr. Chupp, might be forced to do a bilateral mastectomy on a 16-year-old girl who says she's a boy. And now I'm challenged to pray for you. And I realize why we need to speak up, because we can't just as a church say the doors are open and we're not risking anything.
No, look, I don't know what you and your colleagues will face in the coming days. I think that's such a wise observation. It's so easy for people to say, well, just get along. But what if you are forced to celebrate something? What if you're forced to do that sort of a medical procedure? I don't think we know yet the long-term reaction if Roe v. Wade is overturned by the Supreme Court in this Dobbs case. We have seen a level of anger and vitriol and backlash just since that leak of Justice Alito's opinion, which isn't even the final one. We don't know what the final one will be. But we have seen clearly that for those committed, whether knowingly or unknowingly, to the sexual revolution, abortion is an essential right that they don't want to give up. So we have two sides on this issue. One believes every life is sacred and therefore is worthy of protection. This isn't a believe and let believe or live and let live sort of issue. It is essential. The other side believes that the only way to really carry out the vision of the sexual revolution is to have a way to permanently divorce sex from procreation, and that abortion is that way. So in other words, this isn't going anywhere. This is, and I think too, again, because overturning Roe doesn't overturn abortion, it returns to the states the right to set their own abortion policy. Guys, the last time we saw something like this was after the Emancipation Proclamation, where basically you had free states and slave states. And I say this out loud and I'm almost like I'm being hyperbolic, but I'm not. And here's why. Passion about the issue is just as high. What's at stake for both sides is just as high, economically, philosophically, morally. And you're talking about an issue of core human dignity with both of them. So we're going to have abortion states and life states. What this means is in particular states like California, Colorado, that's where I'm at, New York, there's going to be a push to drive through individual rights. And abortion is going to be one of them. But I'm telling you, I think it's absolutely going to be connected. Sexual rights of all kinds, including abortion. We're going to see abortion rights in certain states that take it further than what we've had up to this point. And we're going to see that same impulse also then push out on particular other laws having to do with LGBTQ conscience rights. Transgender surgeries, this is what the new HHS mandate includes. This is such a fascinating thing. The old HHS mandate under the Obama administration was mandating abortifacient coverage through insurance policies for employers and had very limited religious freedom exemptions. It not only forced employers against their conscience to provide abortion-inducing medications, it also defined in law by the state what counts as a church and what doesn't count as a church. That was part of the HHS mandate that was crazy. We can come back to that if you want. What we're doing now, with the word now on the new HHS mandate, which hasn't been issued, but it seems like it will be. And I think we'll see increasingly, if the Dobbs case ends up like we think it is, there's going to be motivation on a state level to not only, again, push out abortion rights, but also state versions of this mandate. Insurance coverage for gender mutilation surgeries and so-called gender-affirming care. It's going to apply, to employers. So this affects the religious freedom of that businessman that came up and said, I had no idea that you were going to have to be forced. And it's going to, affect you as someone who's then going to be forced to, because of the bureaucracy and the system and the insurance coverage and the payment and the financial, there's going to be a lot of pressure to go into areas that Christians can't go in. Look, I know I've kind of gone on here, but let me just finish this. I spoke 2 weeks ago to a group of medical pre-med students at a Christian college, and I'm absolutely convinced of this. I don't think I'm being alarmist. You guys can tell me if you think I am. Group of 8 students that were in pre-med. I think 4 of them want to be doctors, 4 of them want to be nurses. And I said, okay, here's what you need to know. How much does your college cost per year? I think they said $40,000 or something like that. I said, okay, so that means you're going to be going through, spend $160,000 on this undergrad, and then you got to go to med school. Hopefully you won't have to take out too many loans, but at the end of the day, you're going to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to learn a profession, and you'll learn it well. It may be that the most significant decision you'll make to follow Jesus in your career is whether to get fired.
It's true.
I hate to say that. I hope it's not the case. And the rest of us, if that ever happens to any of them, we should be lining up just like we lined up beside Jack Phillips and Barronelle Stutzman, and more people should have, for the record. But I do think we're entering that that's what we mean when we mean a challenge to conscience rights.
Yeah. John, if you're right, which I believe that you very well could be, that could be kind of hopeless for a lot of our listeners. And I know we have the hope of Christ and that God is in control and we're victorious through him. We just got out of an important meeting as we're trying to equip our members, our affiliates, how to speak out, how to engage in this culture, and how to be the voice of truth. I hear a lot of amazing testimonies from our CMDA members who have participated in the Colson Fellow Program. I don't know if you like talking about that or not, but I imagine you do. Tell us about the program and maybe how our members could engage in that to maybe help equip them for what's down the road and how that could be beneficial.
I appreciate that. We're trying as best as we can, just like CMDA is with this wonderful curriculum. And I wish more churches would take it and teach that curriculum, in churches. That would be such a great start to this, because at the very beginning, we still have to deal with the fact that when many people hear the phrase religious freedom or freedom of conscience, what they think is, number one, that it's America. It's like apple pie. Like we're good. Or they think, and this is important, that religious freedom means license to discriminate. In other words, they don't think it's being challenged at all, or they think if it is being challenged, religious freedom is actually a bad thing. We need more churches that are willing to engage what it means to live a public Christian life. And your curriculum, CMDA's curriculum, is so good. It's really so good on this area. But it's just so out of the ordinary where most churches would teach. And that's really tragic, because, you guys as physicians have to think about, what does it mean for me to be a Christian and a doctor? But every young married couple is making ethical decisions about reproductive technologies, about in utero testing. We're going to increasingly have to make decisions about end-of-life care. In other words, this stuff affects every single person. And if we can't even get the fact that a 15-week-old preborn child with its own DNA and a heartbeat and everything like that isn't a life worth protecting. I mean, we're so lost on this, and churches are on the sideline when they don't engage. So I would encourage, first of all, people, that's a great place to start, is to teach that curriculum. And what a great way for the members of CMDA to serve their own churches in that way. What we want to do with the Colson Fellows program is very simple. I think that what we need is a dramatic, we need cultural leadership. And right now, all of our eggs are in the political basket on both the right and the left, and we're perpetually disappointed. These really strong parts of culture that de Tocqueville and others noticed, those things are now gone. So now we have a void, and that void can be filled by the church. I think for a long time, Christians have looked to DC and Hollywood, and Christians in DC and Hollywood to do all the heavy lifting. God bless them. That's not what we need to do. Right. We need Christians everywhere in every community. And that's really the Colson Fellows vision. We have about 800 or 900 Christians a year that go through a 11-month study on Christian worldview and culture. And the idea is to apply their Christian faith to the cultural setting where God has called them. It includes a teaching plan, it includes an implementation plan. But our goal is that communities all across America, and this program, by the way, is delivered either in church communities or in regional communities. So we have 35 churches that offer the Colson Fellows program, 60 different communities in America that have regional cohorts. And basically what we want is for them to go deep and then to walk out and say, okay, God, what does it look like for me to be an agent of restoration in the time and place where you've called me? So that's really where it is. And but how it fits to your question about, okay, what do we do? And that is, first of all, I don't know if we're in a Bonhoeffer moment or a Wilberforce moment. And what I mean by that is a Wilberforce moment and a Bonhoeffer moment look an awful lot alike. The cultures and breakdown. There's cultural chaos. The church seems to be AWOL. I mean, both Bonhoeffer and Wilberforce found their culture at the edge of the abyss. Wilberforce's reforms lead to the Victorian era, lead to the end and abolition of slavery, lead to the championing of rights for women and children and education and everything else. Bonhoeffer's efforts ended in finally a collapse of German civilization at a degree that the world has not seen in recent years. You know what? Whether we're in a Wilberforce moment or a Bonhoeffer moment, life goes on.
Yeah.
People still get sick and need to be treated. Families still have children that need to be educated. People still need to know who Jesus Christ is, you know? And so our task, in a sense, is to be faithful to what is true and engaged in the world around us, whether the culture is falling apart or the culture is rebuilding. We don't know that. T.S. Eliot said, for us, there's only the trying. The rest is none of our business. So we do the best we can and we leave the results up to God. And praise God, let's do it, you know? But that's really what that is. Let's decide right now where we stand. Let's decide right now that we're going to tell the truth. In the words of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, that we're not going to live by lies. We might not show up at every protest. We might not fight every battle, but we're not going to say something that's not true, particularly something that's not true about preborn babies or something that's not true about school-age children, about what it means to be male. We're not going to be forced to say something that's not true. And to the best of our ability, we're going to live out our faith in whatever vocation and calling God has us. If we can make those commitments, if we can decide right now, then I think we might be surprised at how these remarkable little acts of faithfulness can have culture reverberating effect.
That's good.
You know, you think about a Rosa Parks or an Emmett Till. You think about nailing a piece of paper on a door in Germany.
Yeah.
These were relatively small little things, and then they had this dramatic impact.
Ripple effect.
We don't know in God's economy, but here's what we need. Chuck Colson, by the way, had on his desk a plaque, and it said, faithfulness, not success. And I think that's what you and I have to wrestle with. I think that's what CMDA has to wrestle with. I think that's what the Colson Center has to wrestle with, is by God's grace, let's help people be faithful, and we'll leave this success part up to God.
John Stonestreet, you've been, I've learned so much by listening. I can't say I listen every single day of the year to Breakpoint, but I've a number of mantras that you get through that have stuck in my brain. You've already mentioned one of them, the theology of getting fired, which we're going to have to face, students are going to have to face. Another one is ideas have consequences and bad ideas have victims. One of the things I'd like our listeners, CMDA members and other Christians in healthcare, a mantra that on this idea of conscience, John, that I came across on a emergency medicine doctor's blog, interestingly enough, from Colorado, who said, when it comes to patient care, anyone, anywhere, anytime, but I cannot guarantee you anything. And I reserve the right on the things that I'm going to offer to my patients. And so that's a mantra I think we hang on to in healthcare when it comes to conscience rights. I really appreciate your faithfulness and your influence in our culture, following so faithfully after Chuck Colson went to be with the Lord, and for the training and support of so many of our members, as Bert brought up with the Colson Fellow Program. But I wanted to leave you with this. There's a scripture at my commissioning about 3 years ago that I used, and I got to thinking, I wonder if John Stonestreet would appreciate this verse. And I'm going to say this is from the New Living Colson translation. Isaiah 50, verse 7, because the sovereign Lord helps me, I will not be disgraced. Therefore, I have set my face like a stone street, determined to do your will, and I know that I will not be put to shame. So there you go. That's my contribution to you, John. Isaiah 50, verse 7. I threw in the Stonestreet there from Isaiah.
Hey, I love it. That means a ton. Let me also say, too, I love your mantra there for healthcare. That's the sort of clarity we need. That's so, so important because, you know, you've got to decide the difference between healing and enhancement. You've got to decide the difference between healing and mutilation. You've got to, all of these are crazy things that people wouldn't have imagined, 20, 30 years ago that folks that are in your line of work have to figure out. That is a very, very helpful way to think about it. So I encourage you to get that mantra out far and wide. I think it's applicable to the business space as well, for the record. By the way, it doesn't mean you'll be above critique. It doesn't mean that You won't get sued. You won't get fired.
Yeah.
But you need to know that clarity going in. What a great way to think about it.
Thanks for joining us today, John. God bless you, and I look forward to the next Culture Friday with John Stonestreet.
Hey, thanks, guys.
Thank you so much.
Well, I don't know about you, but I could have listened to John Stonestreet share for a whole lot longer. His insight into our culture and worldview is unparalleled, I think, within the Christian community. And I'm so thankful that he took the time to join us for this conversation. If you'd like to learn more from John, then I would highly recommend that you check out Breakpoint at breakpoint.org. He writes a blog each weekday on pressing social issues, particularly as they interface with Christian practice and doctrine. And you can also listen to him on the Breakpoint podcast to hear from John and others on topics like religious freedom, advocacy, worldview, and even more. And if you're interested in learning more about the Colson Fellows Program from the Colson Center, just visit colsoncenter.org. The Colson Center is dedicated to equipping you and me to live out our faith with clarity, confidence, and courage in this poignant cultural moment. Well, during our conversation, you heard us talking about Bridging the Gap, which is a small group study that we have available for church leaders. We are called to be advocates for God's Word, and we are called to speak truth into ethical issues while courageously standing up for what's morally right according to our beliefs. But in order to engage others in these discussions with grace as well as kindness, first, we need to arm ourselves with knowledge and understanding on each of these topics. And that's why we created Bridging the Gap. We hope that this small group study encourages you and others in the church to ask these difficult, thought-provoking questions about the ethical issues facing Christians today. Now, some of these topics are divisive, but we are called as Christians to ask these questions. In the end, we pray it will stimulate minds and stir hearts toward God as we educate and encourage those who seek the truth. Will you share this curriculum with your church leaders and with your small group? It's available for free at no cost to you. So you can visit cmda.org/bridgingthegap to download it today. As John Stonestreet just shared with us in this interview, we need cultural leadership right now. We have a void, and that void can be filled by the church. As Christians in healthcare, we have the opportunity to stand up and fill that cultural need. There are so many ways for you to get involved at CMDA to help fill the cultural need, and one of them is through our advocacy efforts. John Stonestreet mentioned just a few minutes ago that if the U.S. Supreme Court truly does overturn Roe v. Wade, it will be up to each state to decide the future of abortion in their state. And right now, every single state in the U.S. is starting to mobilize. It's truly not difficult to imagine a scenario that he described with abortion states versus non-abortion states. And it doesn't stop with just abortion. As we discussed today, all about our right of conscience in healthcare, it could also be on the table. Will you join our grassroots advocacy efforts in your individual state? The time has never been more critical to defend and care for all our patients and to contend for the conscientious practice of medicine as healthcare professionals of faith who also stand on evidence-based care. As a healthcare professional, your voice, well, it carries weight, and we need that weight and expertise as we boldly stand together. I pray that today is the day that you faithfully take a step forward and answer God's call to join CMDA's advocacy efforts in your own state. As John said, let's help people be faithful, and we'll leave the success up to God. To get involved, just contact CMDA's advocacy and communications team using the email address communications@cmda.org. I do have one event to share with you before we finish this week's episode. You may have heard me mention last week that we at CMDA are partnering with the Hendricks Center at Dallas Theological Seminary to host an in-person conference that we're calling Critical Conversations on Identity and Gender. Medical and pastoral care face a daunting task in the midst of discussions about transgenderism and choices about sexual preference today in the West. As Christians, how do we speak effectively, truthfully, and graciously while giving care in such an environment? Please join us for this critical conversation as we consider the theology, science, legal counsel, and pastoral care required to serve people well, as individual caregivers and as fellow members of society. You can join us live in Dallas, Texas, or you can join us virtually on August 5th and 6th. Registration is now available at cmda.org/events. Well, you won't be able to see or hear from me in the next few weeks as I'm going to be traveling internationally for the month of June. But don't worry, you'll still be able to listen to CMDA Matters. We've got some great episodes planned during my absence, so you don't want to miss a single one. To close out today's episode, I want to share an often used quote from Pastor Martin Niemöller that seems so appropriate after our conversation with John Stonestreet today. And Pastor Niemöller said, "First, they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Well, then they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Well, then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Well, then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me." I hope that our discussion today with John Stonestreet is a clarion call for you as a healthcare professional, and most importantly, as a Christian, to speak out for the religious rights and the conscience rights of all people. We need to do so if we're going to be able to continue bringing hope and healing of Christ to the world. After all, that's what matters to CMDA and CMDA Matters. We'll see you next week, God willing.
This podcast has been a production of the Christian Medical and Dental Associations. The opinions expressed by guests on this podcast are not necessarily endorsed by the Christian Medical and Dental Associations. CMDA is a nonpartisan organization that does not endorse political parties or candidates for public office. The views expressed on this podcast reflect judgments regarding principles and values held by CMDA and its members and are not intended to imply endorsement of any political party or candidate.